Welcome, eCom Logistics Nation. Thank you for joining today's episode. We're on a mission to share e-commerce logistics insights, trends, successes, and challenges from the leaders and innovators in our space.
A lot more of them try to compete with Amazon versus looking, inwardly at their assortment mix or at their product offering and thinking, are there things that we can differentiate on there? And when they did do that, they actually, many of them were quite successful.
Welcome, eCom Logistics Podcast Nation. Excited to welcome today's special guest, Sucharita Kodali, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester. Sucharita is an expert in e-commerce, omnichannel commerce, consumer behavior, and trends in the retail and consumer goods space. She is also an authority on technology developments that affect the online commerce industry and vendors that facilitate online marketing and merchandising. She is the author of Forrester's The World's Most Future-Proofed Brands Report. She is often the keynote speaker at retailer conferences around the world and is frequently featured in national media such as NPR, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg Businessweek, The Information, and more. Prior to Forrester, she held leadership and management roles at Saks Fifth Avenue, Toys R Us, Babies R Us, and the Walt Disney Company. Sucharita, so excited to have you joining us today, and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. I just got to add to that, my experience with Sucharita. I was at a conference, and it was part of like the keynote address or the opening of the conference for Manhattan Associates. And Sucharita gets up there. And I'll tell you, this was my early days of like getting into e-commerce. And Sucharita's just dropping knowledge bombs after knowledge bombs after knowledge bombs. And I'm like, okay, how much can I take? Right? Like it just kept on going. And since then, I'll be very honest, I've been following Sucharita, the reports that she writes or what she has to say in the industry. So I listen to her. So to the audience, listen to her.
Listen to her. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what's really exciting and interesting about your background, and one that we always love, is when someone, in your position comes from first being a practitioner, and as we say, someone who's been in the trenches and experienced it firsthand. So wanted to see if you could share with our listeners your journey and how that practitionership has positioned you to have your current role at Forrester.
Thank you for those kind words. Too kind, and there were lots of knowledge bombs dropped at that conference. I was, yeah. Anyway, but thank you. So my background, I was in the retail world I started in the consumer businesses, a number of different types of roles. Actually, my first corporate job was at Disney in a strategic planning role, which was also sort of an adjunct to market research. So that was where I started my career. And a number of the people on that team launched startups during the first dot-com boom, which was in the late 1990s. So I joined one of those startups, and that led me, it happened to be an e-commerce company, and that led me to retail. So I was in the early days of e-commerce, and then I actually went to traditional retail. I worked at a few different retailers, large multi-brand retailers. I worked at Toys R Us and Saks Fifth Avenue, so big box specialty and department stores. And then when I was at Saks, I actually was a Forrester client, and then the Forrester analyst role came open and I applied for it, and I've been here ever since, which was almost 20 years ago at this point.
So that's how you become a Forrester analyst.
That's how you do it. So you've been at Forrester since 2005, and you've seen so much. There's been such different shifts in the market, shifts in consumer behavior. And what's interesting, I think we find, is that a lot of things are still relatively the same, but other things have shifted dramatically. And, as we're coming out of the pandemic, all we kept saying and hearing is, we can't wait till things get back to normal. We can't wait till things get back to normal. And 2023 so far hasn't been that normal or that kind to the commerce world, whether that's e-commerce or retail. So wanted to see if you could share some of the most important trends that you're seeing in retail and the consumer goods space, and what companies should be paying attention to And on top of that, the logistics companies that support them should be paying attention to so that they could be a really good provider and a strategic partner for them.
Yeah. So I would say these today, there's definitely a lot that's changing and evolving. The marketing landscape, which of course every retailer has spent a lot of time investing in for the purposes of customer acquisition and retention. I mean, that's changing. And one of the single biggest things that seems to be emerging is the growth of retail media, which is retailers now as media properties. So that's definitely been something that's that I hear a lot from brands, from retailers, from agencies and ad tech companies that are in that space. From a logistics standpoint, I think that we spent a lot of time in the last decade talking about things like on-demand delivery and same-day delivery. And I think that a number of the challenges that existed in those sectors still exist to this day, largely related to high costs of labor, particularly in markets like the United States. There's just the challenges with cost-effectively getting packages quickly to end consumers. The opportunities, I think, are bigger outside of the United States. When you look at some of the largest VC-funded retail companies, they were often last-mile delivery players, but often in regions like Asia. So things are continuing to evolve. I think that some of the challenges with those ultra-fast C-store delivery companies like GoPuff and others like, Gorillas, and, the list is pretty long. I was just looking at the number of them that were sort of seen as pandemic golden children that now have essentially fallen out of favor because they're so financially challenged. That's, I think, just another illustration of the problems that we have with delivery. But then there are also, I think that there's a lot of, that's why we are continuing to see the investments in, whether it's in-store pickup or ship-to-store programs or some of these alternative fulfillment vehicles. We have heard a lot about changes and developments in the returns process. It's a huge cost center for most retailers. So just looking at how you can make returns just less costly and potentially even, kind of maybe something that can be tied to customer loyalty or maybe in the long term, some type of lifetime value. So those are, some of the things that we're hearing about, not necessarily the sexiest things, but things that are important and are big drivers of profitability and whether or not consumers actually purchase with a retailer or not. We'll probably talk about AI, which it seems like every social media post and news article is about that topic these days. But I think that there's a lot that is a lot of hype, a lot of unknowns, a lot of speculation. That is one thing that I think has stayed the same is that, kind of every time there's some hyped topic, people get into, whip themselves up into a frenzy about it. And, it becomes like the topic of every conversation. And it's great for speeches because it's plenty of fodder for things to talk about. But a lot of these things, are much ado about nothing. Not that AI is. I think there are parts of AI, and it's a misunderstood topic. But yeah, a lot of times there are things that are hyped, but the reality is that they're probably not deserving of the mind share that they're capturing.
And I mean, talking about the hype, like if you go back to the pandemic, and I kind of think about some of the conversations that we had with folks, we saw this massive boom in online commerce, right? Direct to consumer from a brand perspective or direct to consumer, Amazon, etc., marketplace strategy from a retailer standpoint, where we started seeing this boom and everyone's like, okay, this is going to be the new normal because we accelerated the total volume, right? Like we work on the logistics side. We had to support that logistical kind of boom that came with it. And everyone's like, this is the new normal. And everyone started reacting to that, the purchase orders that got cut. It seems like as we come around the corner of this pandemic, the pullback is greater than almost anyone anticipated, at least, the sentiment in the market. Like you look at some of the news cycle items like Gap or American Eagle or whoever, right? Like you are seeing a really big pullback. Like, what's your vantage point? What happened, right? Like, did we over anticipate what's going to happen post-pandemic, or did people plan it incorrectly? Like, what's your vantage point on that?
Well, the macro story, is still one of growth, albeit for e-commerce and even for retail, albeit it is sort of normalized growth. So the way some numbers, so if in 2019 retail or e-commerce grew maybe 14% year over year, in 2020, it grew 30%. And now we're back down to 14% or even less than that. But it's still positive growth. And you're looking at growth on a big base that happened in 2020. So the numbers are larger than they've ever been. But when if you were to take out the kinks in the curve and just sort of draw a straight line, it would be flatter. And I think that maybe that's what is surprising to people, is that they thought that the growth from 2020 would continue on for years and years and forever. And that's something that I think has also stayed the same, is the lack of recognition of that reality. The law of large numbers always means that your growth is going to eventually slow down. I mean, we're seeing that with companies like Amazon now. But also you see that just because there's enormous growth over a period of time, especially a period of time that was an anomaly in history, there is no reason to expect that would continue. And in fact, you would be making a big mistake if you were making bets based on that, which has turned out to be, what's happened. But that's something that I see over and over and over again, like with every, kind of every hyped topic or any, kind of in that hyped topic in 2020 was, this burst of e-commerce or online grocery continuing forever, or, the ability of Instacart to continue to grow for years and years at, kind of its peak pandemic growth. I mean, but yet, kind of even knowing what we know, people still think that there is that possibility. And, maybe it's optimism and maybe it's hope. Like, kind of we felt that, people feel that way about crypto every time, the numbers go back up for the value of Bitcoin, right? It's this hope and this dream that, what you just saw will continue forever, and or at least enough to make you very wealthy. And and occasionally there are those data points in history. You always hear that if I had only put in $100 into Microsoft in 1920, which of course is not, I'm making that up, but what I'm saying is, like, kind of everybody's afraid of missing the next big thing, and I think that that's the reason that you see this excitement. And then you see the disappointment, but it's not really anything to be disappointed about. The numbers are fine. It's just they weren't they weren't the numbers that I think people may have expected them to be when they looked into the future in 2020.
So, Sucharita, what I find really interesting is the fact that, VC-backed companies, new brands didn't have the foresight, and, maybe it's right for them to be disappointed. How are publicly traded companies that were out there that actually didn't have the foresight and made the decisions of some of the investments that they made, or, in expecting that the growth was just going to continue? I mean, Amazon, it hasn't taken that big of a hit at this point, right? Of course, there is a little bit of slide down, but if you look at they essentially doubled the number of resources that they have in the company. And when they let 20,000 people go out of that, it's like, it's a big deal. But I think there is a lot of retail that we, at least, my observation, and not researched observation, just reading the news, it almost feels like they got it wrong as well, right? Like, and again, maybe it's more a statement than a question, but like my observation is, retailers got it wrong of what they should have expected to happen in purchasing and how much purchasing ended up happening. Because what we do see right now is warehouses are bursting through the seams with the amount of over purchasing that ended up happening with the pandemic.
Yeah. There is no question that we had a lot of essentially the bullwhip effect in retail supply chain. You see that in electronics right now. It's one of the few categories that even in the last year has experienced deflationary pricing pressures. And that's because, there were the initial, all the component shortages early in the pandemic. So then there was the over ordering, to compensate for that lack of supply. And then you ended up with a glut by the time everything normalized. And then interestingly, then you had supply chain issues in other sectors. You had wage pressures in other sectors too. And so you've seen some of that inflation impact. And now, as warehouses are bursting at the seams, you can probably anticipate that prices will fall. So it will. So there's no doubt that will happen soon enough. But I think that we were maybe talking about two slightly different things. On the one hand, it is, we started the conversation talking about expectations in e-commerce demand. And e-commerce demand is still higher than it was before. There's no question about that. So it's doing okay. But then there's the reaction to maybe some macro or systemic factors that led to inventory overages. And that is, I think that those are just, I don't know that there's a way to get around that until we get to just in general, more nimble supply chains, more product on demand, customized product, until we get to diversified supply chains, which we may never get to. I think that we make bets based on the information that we know at the time. And, kind of only when there are shocks do you diversify out of those issues. And one of the things we learned from the pandemic was that, kind of maybe we are too concentrated with our supply chains in Asia, particularly in China. Then you add on some of the geopolitical issues. I think companies are gradually recognizing that maybe they do need to diversify their supply chains. But it's a painful decision to have to make that, because then what happens is that you have to increase the cost of your inputs. There's a reason that we concentrated in a handful of regions, because it was more cost effective to do that. And now we don't have that. If we don't have that luxury anymore, we don't see the benefit of it anymore. You have to make the decision that you were trying to avoid making all along, which is, kind of increasing that cost of the supply chain. Now, what I do think, the opportunity that potentially comes from this is maybe we do see more automation. Maybe, robotics and AI do end up helping us to better, more easily and more quickly diversify some of those supply chains. I always point to the fact that like auto manufacturers are a great example where with increases in automation, you actually are able to produce cars in really high cost regions of the world. Like BMW makes, I think all of its 3 Series cars in the city of Munich, which is one of the most expensive cities in the world. They manufacture all their SUVs in South Carolina. Again, in the United States, an expensive cost of labor, relative to the rest of the world. But part of the way that they're able to do that is that the labor is relatively, the cost of labor is relatively low because they have fewer workers, and, they're able to automate so much. So, kind of when you do that and you combine that with the speed to market or the ability to customize products, at least in a sector like luxury, net, you end up with, you end up at parity from a production standpoint versus trying to go for these mass, kind of warehouses that, kind of you have to produce so much in order to get that low, kind of that low variable cost. So it'll be interesting to see how things evolve and how manufacturing evolves. And if over time we do have more automation and robotics and automation and robotics in manufacturing, which may bring, kind of production to where the consumption actually is.
And we are seeing the same thing on the warehousing side. I think everyone's kind of aware, right? Like you see the amount of automation, specifically where it's suitable, right? Like CPG brands from a, dark store type warehousing environments to, e-commerce significantly investing in, automation. These automation techs, we have been doing some internal research on this, and it seems like the next 5 to 7 years, just the return on investment, the IRR on some of these things are becoming so much more lucrative that anyone with that capital investment capability in the e-commerce space is going to be investing. I mean, we are looking at a rapid rise of automation, and it already feels like there is a lot in warehousing, specifically on e-commerce, and there is even more coming, right? And a lot more from a robotics standpoint over the next 5 to 7 years is kind of the space. So yeah, we don't look into manufacturing, but it sounds like it's the same thing that's probably going to end up playing out on that side of the universe.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it all evolves and shakes out. And some will, some of it will be more viable than others. I mean, I don't know that we'll necessarily see driverless deliveries. There are a lot of issues there, but absolutely any type of automation or robotics in warehouses is likely some of the best places where it could go, like pick and pack facilities and sortation facilities for sure.
Exactly. What we see is the EVs are coming in first, and then the driverless is going to come, right? So the EVs are going to play a big part first, right? So no, that's super interesting. And this is a question we pretty much ask most of our guests, right? So Dan and I started working together on e-commerce back in like 2015 timeframe with one hypothesis. Because of Amazon, everyone needs everything in 2 days, right? So from a delivery standpoint, I can tell you we were wrong, right? What is your opinion from, pandemic, post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, wherever it be? What is the consumer expectation shaping up to be today from a delivery experience, right? Like that checkout abandonment, like what do you see the consumers wanting today? What kind of delivery?
Well, in an ideal world, I mean, everybody wants fast and free, but that is behind the veil of ignorance, that's what they want when they don't realize or they don't think about or they're not exposed to, what abuses of the environment, of your roads, of workers may be happening to get you that product, very quickly. So that's what we have become accustomed to because, like young children, we've been shielded from the truth. So it's like Santa Claus, but the truth is that when, kind of people realize that there's an environmental cost, that they're, even with cheap products, if people are told that this is a subpar ingredient, or this is something that's pollutive, or this is something that was made at the expense of, human rights abuses, people are very, very reluctant, much, much more reluctant to consume that product. So there's a bit of an education that is happening now with respect to fulfillment. So in that world, what we're seeing is as long as companies are transparent, like this is what's going to come to you and this is when it's available and when we expect it to get to you, that's seemingly enough for people's needs, especially if it's also communicated with we're going to try to do the best we can and, kind of be good to the environment in the process and not be wasteful in the way that we're executing. So I do think that expectations are changing a bit. There's still a long way to go. I mean, I don't think that people realize the cost of, kind of 8 large trucks coming into your neighborhood, every 3 hours. It's not something that, there have even really been numbers put on. But, these are absolutely costs, and eventually people will either become aware of them or the costs are going to go up enough that, it sort of makes sense to in many ways, just get things in the most efficient way possible, which is where things like in-store pickup or locker pickup or ship-to-store programs, or just even do your research online and know where things are before you go, are often some of the most effective ways to complete transactions. So I think that's part of what we did see in the pandemic, is a lot more of that omni-channel buying, a lot more comfort with that omni-channel buying. I think that programs like the way that Target executed in-store pickup were really strong. Like, they still have, I think, a long way to go in making the economics as cost effective as it can be. And kind of maybe new store builds are going to have more, they may have more robotics or more, kind of deliveries to a bay or whatever that make it, kind of not quite so labor intensive. But, I think that they're onto something, and kind of at scale, you could see that being an approach that works much, much more cost effectively.
Oh, really good points.
Yeah, I think that's great points. And we work with a lot of hyper-growth, hockey stick curve merchants and brands that try to be digital native. Then they typically go into the omni-channel world. But, going back to what Ninad said about our thesis back in 2015, I think a lot of brands still feel that way today, that they have to offer a 2-day, a Prime-like service. And what we have found is more and more brands are taking a look at their data and their analytics, and they're looking at the LTV of their client base. And they're actually finding, a few that we've been working with recently, that to your point, so long as the communication and the expectations are set during the purchasing experience, that even a 5-day or a 7-day delivery does not adversely affect the LTV of their customer. Once it gets past that, then there's a negative and there's a fall off and there's a risk of long-term value and repeat purchases. So are you seeing more brands, more retailers taking a look at that data and making some decisions on deferred shipment options, or again, as long as it's communicated properly to the customer during the buying experience, that we're going to maybe start seeing more and more of that happening in the market?
Well, I think that the companies that created a lot of the frenzy around shipping were the ones that fundamentally didn't really have differentiated offerings. They were selling the same things that Amazon is selling, and net all being equal. If you are slower than Amazon, you have the same products, and you're not even pricing better, and you may even be pricing worse. Like, you really don't have a choice but to either lower your prices or increase your speed of shipping. For everybody else, like all of those merchants out there that have unique differentiated products, they may be mono brands, maybe they have just a unique assortment that others don't have. They didn't have that same issue. Like, you did have the luxury of shipping slower because people wanted your product for other reasons. And if people want your product, you are in a position to be able to, usually have a longer ship time and a longer fulfillment period, a longer grace period for that. So, but those mass products are a huge portion of what's sold, and it's often some of the largest retailers in the country. So that was the reason that we saw the pressure that we saw. But the solution, there were, two ways that you can compete there. You can try to run with Usain Bolt, or you can try to change the game. And, a lot more of them tried to compete with Amazon versus looking, inwardly at their assortment mix or at their product offering and thinking, are there things that we can differentiate on there? And when they did do that, they actually were, many of them were quite successful, whether they were leaning into private label products or, kind of they found unique items and they really leaned into that. You see all of that, even in a sector this is not a new story. Like, you look in a sector like grocery, it's a great example, right? It's the largest, but yet also one of the most competitive sectors in all of retail. The way to compete if you're a new entrant in grocery is not to try to be Kroger, with its assortment or its size. The companies that have succeeded in growing market share in grocery are companies like Lidl, or over the last, several decades, companies like Trader Joe's, which have very differentiated offerings and, kind of have a different approach. It's a different store format. It's, it's more of a treasure hunt model. It's a lot of, the case of Trader Joe's, it's a lot of, kind of what's now become the common expression of the drop. Trader Joe's was dropping things all the time in grocery. You'd have like some maple syrup available for like 3 weeks and then it'd be gone for like the next 2 years. And, if you got it or you didn't, so, but that's been their strategy. And it's not like it's a mystery. It's not like it's something that others can't do, but yet they're one of the only ones that do it to this day.
Right. No, that's an amazing point. And I think what a great segue, as mentioned during the intro, you authored the world's most future-proof brands report and wanted to see if you could share some of your findings from that body of work and what advice you might share for e-commerce companies looking to future-proof their business and adapt to the new world that we're living in.
Yeah, so that is, it was an evaluation of brand manufacturers, so companies that are essentially B2B2C, they're wholesale companies or primarily wholesale companies. And it was looking at their digital commerce strategies. So how, if they were selling directly to consumers, how good was their approach to that? Did they have an easy, did they have all product content available? Are all of their items available for sale? That's something that's like a really basic miss for a lot of brands, is that they won't show all of the information. They won't have all of their products. They won't show all the information for all of their products. And then they don't even expose if and where that product is available. They're missing some of these key things that people are there to find out. And if you miss those key points, you're going to miss, at least a portion of commerce that you may have otherwise transacted. But it's more than just direct to consumer. It's also the presence on marketplaces and, is that presence, especially given the prevalence of third-party sellers, is your look and feel and your pricing and all of your product content, is it consistent? Are you, putting or are there third-party sellers putting rogue content out there, which confuses the shopper because you don't know what was actually, the most recent Fiber One package, and am I getting the old one or, is this what it looks like now? Those were some of the attributes as well. And then we were also looking at things like just the brand energy and, is this a product that is generating excitement? Whether it is in the number of searches that people are making for a product, or whether it's in the number of followers that a brand may be having on social media. So it was a pretty holistic look at, essentially a company's digital presence and whether or not those brands were seemingly well positioned for a successful future based on how strongly they were executing, those different elements that we'd evaluated in the evaluations. And, it shouldn't be, some of the most well-regarded brands are some of those brands that really did well on these, on this review. It was companies like Nike and Apple, but there were others, too, that fared quite well. A lot of like the Estee Lauder brands, which are probably some of the longstanding leaders in sectors like beauty. There were there are even in CPG brands like M&M's, fared very well in this review. So yeah, it was my advice in general is digital is such a big part of the purchase journey, of the research journey, that brands that overlook those elements just stand to lose. And the more that you focus on the presence, the consistency of the information, generating excitement in a way that is not brand delusional is those are really, kind of at the heart of what we were looking for.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you brought up M&M specifically, right? A lot of these brands that we have noticed is on the CPG side, isn't there a bit of a conflict when it comes to, working with the retailers and also being a direct-to-consumer brand at the same time? And like, how does that kind of shape out? Because I had some experience in the past where some CPG brands, I was working with Unilever trying to figure out their distribution strategy for just one product line that they wanted to take a Shopify store and, present the product suite. But then there is definitely a little bit of a rub, be like, can we really take everything, right? Like, how does Walmart view it or Target view it or whatever, right? Like their general ecosystem. Is there a negative counter effect, or it's generally acceptable practice now?
So channel conflict is definitely one of the biggest concerns that brands have with anything that they're really doing online, whether it's selling directly to consumers, even with marketplaces. There's this perception that marketplaces aren't necessarily the best for maintaining a strong relationship with your traditional wholesale partners, and rightfully so, because marketplaces often just kind of push their way into the retail discussion by working with rogue distributors initially, and they got the merchandise whether the brands actually cooperated with them or not, and that that ended up being that still to this day is a source of tension that a lot of brands are navigating through. So it is there. I don't know that it is going to go away, but there are ways. I mean, you almost can go through kind of whichever dyad is the one that is most problematic and talk through different strategies that companies have. Like in the case of direct to consumer, many brands are choosing to, maybe offer, kind of certain types of higher end, higher ticket items. Like you see this often in like the CPG category, like toothpaste. They'll often use the web for, kind of maybe electric toothbrushes or things that are higher ticket purchases that the web is actually very, very well suited for. Or it could be the replacement heads for those electric toothbrushes, that kind of thing. They may choose to have different approaches with their direct to consumer and how they fulfill. There was a company years ago that ultimately folded into what's now eCommerce, but they basically had a way for brands to capture orders on their website, and they would farm out the transactions. They would farm out the fulfillment to local stores, so that's how you sort of manage the channel conflict, and you could still let the stores who are your distribution partners capture sales. So there are lots of ways to manage through this. It's thinking outside of the box a bit, and kind of not simply. I think that where companies have gotten into trouble with things like DTC or even marketplaces is just not investing heavily in the experience. Like the most problematic executions with direct to consumer are when you take an individual item and you put it in like a large cardboard box and you ship it to somebody. Like, that's not gonna be a win-win-win for anybody. It's going to be a lose-lose-lose for everybody. But yet, kind of that's still sort of the approach that a lot of companies are pursuing with their direct to consumer businesses. And it needs to be more thoughtful than that. So we'll see how things evolve. I mean, I still think that brands in e-commerce, it's still relatively early for them. These are companies that historically have been very used to just selling through wholesale channels, and they're used to a very traditional, almost like a distributor rep model. And it's a little bit different now. And,
exactly.
But they're only grappling with that change. They have only been grappling with that change maybe in the last 5 to 10 years.
I'll just add to that, the logistics side of that, Sucharita, is also a big hole because they are used to pallet in, pallet out operations in a CPG environment, right? I've walked into these buildings and they're like, okay, I'm not going to name names, but like there are these brands that are like, we are going to start doing e-commerce. We are going to start selling on Amazon. We're going to have a 1P strategy with Amazon. We are going to have a 3P strategy with Amazon. We are going to have a dropship model with Walmart, right? And then we are going to have our own Shopify store or a Salesforce Commerce Cloud, like a digital web presence that's out there. And cool, you got the digital strategy. But when it comes to the logistics side of it, neither are there systems or the capabilities to be able to execute on any of those strategies ready. And when they plan on doing those, the digital side moves much faster because you can hire an agency, you can build a strategy, you can hire Forrester to give you the strategy itself and do that. But the logistics side is still dependent on their SAP IT, their Oracle IT, the changes that are necessary, or whatever warehousing system that they are using to be able to execute upon that. So it's a really interesting, just looking at both sides of that equation, at least the way I see it.
Yeah, for sure. The logistics piece of it is probably one of the most interesting ones. I don't know. Amazon is probably one of they may push it much like they pushed ads and, kind of retail ads to the forefront in retail. They're, of course, now fulfilling orders for other merchants. And that's something that Andy Jassy talked about in his most recent shareholder letter. So if they do that and they're able to be this brand partner for fulfillment, and oh, by the way, it makes sense for them to do so because they're already shipping for, kind of items that are already sold on Amazon.com, it stands to reason that others may, like a Walmart or a Target or other big retailers, may consider something similar as well. I always wondered, kind of why can't you think of things? I mean, everything is optimized for the pallet in retail, right? And what that means is that, kind of I can understand that it may not make sense to break the pallet, but why can't you mix the pallet? And, can you mix the pallet with, kind of some of those e-commerce long tail items that the consumer is ordering? And, rather than shipping it to a home in a separate cardboard box, why can't you just ship it to the store that's closest to the consumer in the pallet that's already going there? And, it's a scan with minimal cost to kind of setting it aside. And, kind of the labor costs may come with the same labor costs that you have now with it when there's buy online, pick up in store. But kind of that's much more cost effective than, kind of the whole UPS or FedEx box going to somebody's house. So I am hopeful for some changes, but these are foreign ways of thinking. And, kind of right now, nobody wants to manufacture 10 times more different types of product on the same line. They'd rather just manufacture one, but I go back to, this is the beauty of automation, is that the variable cost of doing that kind of thing that the consumer wants in the world of automation is much less onerous than it may have been like 20 or 30 years ago.
Beautiful. Love it.
Absolutely.
And on that topic of why they don't do it, I think we'd need another podcast for an hour just talking about breaking a case versus breaking a pallet. And yet some companies do it really well. Like Target has a specific, store presets as an example, where they are already doing that, where they are building a pallet of boxes that are going to the store that have multiple items inside the cases being shipped into the stores. But how do you leverage that for eCom? And not like Target needs a lot of recommendation on how to do e-commerce because they do it pretty well. So
Right.
Sucharita, the nugget bombs were flying, and there was so much more we wanted to cover. So I think we'll send an invite for maybe down the road to join us for episode 2 with you. But want to thank you so much for joining us today, and want to give you an opportunity to share with the audience where they could follow you, how to learn more. I mean, everyone knows about Forrester, but maybe certainly how to follow you and the content that you produce at Forrester.
Probably these days I'm most active on on LinkedIn. Twitter and LinkedIn are probably the best places to reach me. There's also a Forrester blog that I will occasionally post on as well. So any of those places. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. And we only covered about 30% of what we wanted.
I know.
So this is for real, right? Like looking at the notes. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm sure we'll plan for a second one.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to maximize your supply chain. Available on all major podcasting channels. Thank you for listening and see you in the next episode.